Hello, my name's Seb. I'm going to be giving a session just now called Using BDD as a Communication Tool Between a Business and Technology. As I go through, I'm clearly going to introduce what BDD is and explain my take on it. I'm also going to be describing some of the problems that I've seen with communication between business and technology. And when I talk about technology here, I'm not talking about the business trying to interact with a particular piece of software. I'm talking about the communication between the business and the delivery team. So that will comprise developers, testers, security, UX, all sorts of people. So you may have seen this cartoon before. It's been around for decades, and it kind of describes how communication can go wrong. People think that they understand what they're being told, but without actually checking with feedback or having close collaboration, we can quite quickly get a game of telephones going on where what you get at the end isn't what was requested or expected by the customer. And this can happen in all sorts of different ways. And one of the reasons that BDD came into existence was to try and solve the. So let's think about successful projects. Well, in our successful projects, we don't want to have the sort of problem where the customer is expecting one thing, they get delivered something else, and then we have to go and do some rework. So there's a few things that we will look for in successful projects, and these things we've actually seen exhibited by the successful projects that we've worked on. So if everyone involved in the delivery of a project has a shared understanding of what's expected, what the business problems were, what success looks like, then this is obviously going to help make the project itself successful. Most projects, especially now that we work in an agile way, projects don't go from just started to being completely finished. They work in an iterative and incremental way. Even old waterfall style projects used to produce a product, and then you would have enhancement requests from customers. And so one of the things we're looking for in a successful project or within a successful product is an ability to detect any breakages that we make while we're trying to deliver the next increment or trying to enhance an existing product. To support this, we actually need a code base that supports change. This is often known as a testable code base, but however we architect our code base, we need to be able to enhance it and extend it. No product is ever correct the first time, and if a product is successful, we're going to want to grow it and build on it. As a development team and as a test team, we'd like to know what the next thing to do is. So some of this is taken care of by agile methods, but we'd love to have some support from our process and from our tooling. And finally, we'd like to know when we're done. So once we've specified what the product should do and we've delivered that, we'd like some way of getting that feedback that says, you're finished now. You can move on to either another project or another product. Behavior-driven development has been around now for over a decade. It was created by a guy called Dan North in London back in the early 2000s, and it's moved on a long way from his original intent, which was to try and help teach developers test-driven development without getting them to think about testing. This is the definition of BDD that comes from the Agile extension to the IIBA's BABOK. So IIBA is the International Institute of Business Analysts, and the BABOK stands for Business Analyst Book of Knowledge. So an approach that enhances the communication between stakeholders and project team members by expressing product needs as concrete examples. We'll be talking about this a lot more over the next 10-15 minutes, but what I really want you to pull away from this or take away from this particular definition is that it says nothing about testing. So I will be harping back to this point a number of times over the next during this session. BDD is not about testing. BDD is a communication and collaboration technique, and we'll look at concrete examples as we go through. This is an alternative definition of BDD, which Matt Wynn penned and is published on the BDD documentation site, which is linked at the bottom. And again, it focuses on closing the gap, communicating essentially between business people and technical people. And it specifically calls out shared understanding, because otherwise we're going to have misunderstandings, working in rapid small iterations, because BDD builds on agile ways of working, and automatically checking that the documentation is correct. This is something that's called living documentation. And again, I will go into more details later on. So the important question, I guess, given that this session is called helping the business and technology communicate more effectively, is where does the business fit into this BDD thing? Well, typically in waterfall projects, you see the business write or at least own the creation of specification documents, which will then get handed over to architects, designers, developers, and testers. BDD tries to move that dynamic somewhat. So the BDD approach starts, as you would expect, by picking a user story. So agile methods typically use user stories for planning, planning increments and scheduling them. Having picked a user story, then the BDD practitioner will move into a discovery phase, or rather a discovery process. Now, discovery here is in italics because it's a term that we use within the BDD world, and maybe we don't use it in exactly the same way that it's used in other product spheres. Here, discovery means a collaborative discussion between the three amigos. And here the three amigos encompass somebody from the business, somebody from development, and somebody from test. And this collaboration typically uses a structured conversation technique that we call example mapping. And the output is an example map which clearly shows the scope of the story broken down into rules and concrete examples. More of that to come. Once a story has been through discovery and all the participants are confident that they have had all of their questions answered and they have a full and shared understanding of what that story is supposed to deliver, then we move into formulation, again in italics because it has a specific meaning, which I will cover. And here what we do is we convert the concrete examples that were discovered or unearthed during discovery, and we convert them into business readable documentation. Typically, we will do that in a format known as Gherkin, which you may be familiar with from the keywords given, when, then. That formulation, those scenarios written in the business terminology using given, when, then, need then to be reviewed by the entire team to ensure that everybody expected those terms to be used. So when you convert from a concrete example, which might be in short form or a sketch, and you're converting that into written documentation, like with any writing project, you need to get some feedback on it, and other people need to read it to make sure that it still makes sense to them. Once the formulation has taken place, we now have scenarios written in the Gherkin format, and we move into development. And development here, it's a big bubble. I'm not going to go into detail what takes place here, but what I do want to say is that this is where the formulated scenarios get automated, and your development team will move into whatever development process they follow, which we would encourage test-driven development, or TDD. But the wonderful thing is that by driving the development from these scenarios written given, when, then, those scenarios then get automated and become living documentation. And living documentation is documentation that will tell you when it's out of date. Again, more of that later. And when we're done with development, we go back and pick another story to work on. So, discovery. I'm going to cover the three main facets of BDD just now. They are discovery, formulation, and automation. And then we'll go back and sum it up. So discovery is essentially a place where, as I said, it's the three amigos get together to collaborate, but it's a place where we arrive at a shared understanding. And the people that go to the discovery workshop, their responsibility is to ask actual questions about the requirements or the story as far as they understand it. So it's the product owner or the business analyst's job to bring a story to a discovery workshop, and hopefully they will have got as far as thinking about what acceptance criteria there are for that story. But that's typically not enough to truly understand all the ramifications, the whole scope of the story. And so these sort of questions are often questions that get asked at a discovery workshop. And what we're going to do is we're going to try asking these questions using examples. So example mapping is a technique that has been documented by Matt Wynn on the cucumber.io blog, which is linked at the bottom of this screen. And as I said, the product owner will come to the example mapping workshop with a user story and hopefully a number of acceptance criteria or business rules that govern the scope of that story. The questions that we saw in the previous slide in the white bubbles get articulated by the tester and the developer and any other people that are attending the workshop. They get articulated as concrete examples. So essentially the concrete example is, look, if I'm going to a library but it's on a Sunday, then should I expect it to be shut? So that would be the example. The example is I go to the library, it's Sunday, I go to the library is shut. And what we have is we have examples to illustrate each rule. So beneath each rule, you would place the examples that illustrate or make that rule clearer. And we create more examples as the workshop goes on. We might also get to a point where we ask a question or we have an example and we ask the product owner, is this how it's supposed to behave? And the product owner isn't sure, wants to go back to the customer's stakeholder. Or it might be a technical question and somebody needs to go off and check on the existing platforms that we have available. However, whatever type of question it is, we capture it on a red card and move on. The point of these red cards, these question cards, is to unblock the discussion to ensure that we can keep the discovery workshop short and yet get through a lot of important disambiguation, a lot of important discovery techniques. We might also come up with examples that don't appear to illustrate any of the rules or acceptance criteria that the product owner has currently identified. And that's quite typical. And it often means that either there was a rule that was that the product owner assumed everybody knew about, but they didn't, or actually we've discovered some extra facet of this story that hadn't previously been thought about. So we create another rule. And that's how the discovery process using example mapping proceeds. Over 30 minutes or so, we build out the story, we uncover new rules using examples, we illustrate existing rules using examples, we gather questions. If we've got lots of questions, it means that really we need to go back and do some more investigation of what the context of this story. Basically, we're not ready to start developing or working on this story. There are too many outstanding questions. If, on the other hand, we find that we've got loads and loads of rules, this is a pretty good indication that this story is maybe bigger than we would normally want to bite off in one small chunk. And we can use these rule cards to split the story into multiple smaller stories that can be delivered, again, through rapid iteration. So let's try an example. And we're going to try some requirements elicitation using rules and examples. And the story is display a library opening times. The rule that I'm going to play with is library opening hours are Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Okay. So let's have a look at a specific example. I checked the library website. Should it be open on Monday, the 4th of May of this year at 10 o'clock in the morning? That seems like a very straightforward answer. The rules are that it's open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So on Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning, it should be open. Only in the UK, at least, Monday, the 4th of May is a holiday. The wonderful thing about concrete examples is that they force you to think about edge cases. This, I will agree, is a very contrived example, but the very same type of activity, the very same type of realization takes place every time I've run example mapping sessions at client sites. It's the concreteness of the example that makes it a powerful interrogation tool. It opens up and focuses on people on a specific set of data rather than a much vaguer, the much vaguer rule that we started off with. So there's a relationship between rules and examples. Examples illustrate the rules. So the point is that the rules are the business rules. It's the way the business wants to talk about how the system is supposed to behave. But to get clarity, to make sure that we implement the right thing, we need to have concrete examples that cover edge cases and surface misunderstandings and ambiguities. The great thing about those examples is that they can become tests, because what is an example except for saying, in this situation, the system should behave in this way? And the system itself implements the rules, because that's what developers do. That's what we're doing when we're writing code. We're taking the rules as we understand them and we're turning them into computer software language. And then the tests can verify that the system behaves in the way that has been described in the examples. So these are the relationship between rules and examples is that, obviously examples illustrate the rules, but let's think about the differences between rules and examples. Rules are abstract. So if we say the library is open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, that feels quite concrete until you start thinking about the fact, well, there are lots of holidays, that there's daylight saving that comes in. There are lots of different hours in the day. And this rule, it's abstract in the sense that it covers all of the possible hours of the day and every day within the year. Whereas the concrete example is saying, will it be open at 10 o'clock on Monday, the 4th of May, 2020, is one particular data point. We wouldn't want to implement the software using those concrete examples, because that is just, there are an infinite number of concrete examples. So the rules are an important way of wrapping things up in an abstract way, and the examples are a concrete exploration of, should it really behave in this way given this set of input data? And another way of saying this is that the rules are concise. You've got a sentence that covers an infinite number of possible inputs, whereas the examples are precise. They cover one single example of how that rule might be acted on. Examples are a great way to start a conversation. So if someone asks you to do something and you say, do you mean in this situation you want it to work like this? That's you asking a question using an example. And then that starts a conversation where the person who's requesting you to do some work can say, no, I didn't mean it quite like that, or not always like that. Sometimes you have to, and so on. There are always exceptions. And when you can have then refined the rule so that it conforms to all of the examples that illustrate it, now that's a great place to close the conversation, because the rule and the examples together now form a unit that can be understood unambiguously by anyone who needs to work on that piece of functionality. And finally, the rules are close to the solution while the examples are closer to the problem. So if you think about it, if you have a problem you've got a defect that's reported by a customer, that's going to be typically an example. This is the problem. On such and such a day, I went to the library, I was expected to be open, but it was shut. This is an example, and it's close to a problem. It expresses a set of data that caused behavior that was unexpected. Whereas the rules are close to the solution. They are what is going to be implemented by the developers in the source code, in the software itself. An example itself is always structured of 3 parts, and I'm going to start at the end. So let's start with the outcome. The outcome is the behavior that is expected. There's an action which causes the system to provide this output, this outcome, and there's a context within which that action will lead to this outcome. If you change the context, the same action may lead to a different outcome. The same context with the same action may lead to other outcomes as well. There's many variations. However, the wonderful thing about this is it breaks down examples into 3 concrete divisions of abstract thought processes of how to think about it, which is an example is a context, an action, and an outcome. And whenever you look at an example, you should be able to identify those three distinct parts. Examples themselves illustrate and describe how the system should behave in a given context action situation. That's the behavior. Given that context and that action, this is how it should behave. And the system itself is defined by the sum of its behaviors. So by working with examples, we can begin to show we can begin to paint in small parts of the behavior of the system. And by summing them all together, by implementing all of those behaviors, we get the behavior of the system that our customer is expecting. So I'm going to try an experiment just now with interaction on this talk. So we're going to look at this specific library requirement. This library is a free library. You can take out any books that are on the shelves. But if you want to reserve an item that's currently out on loan, there are some rules, and some of them lead to you having to pay charges. So the rules are that if you've got an adult membership, you pay £1 per item. If you've got a child membership, you can reserve up to 6 children's books free, but you have to pay 50p per item for all other items. Now that seems straightforward, and I would like you at home to consider what questions would you want to ask about these rules. I'd love you to chuck some of those questions into the Slack channel, and I would like you to use the format context action outcome. So for instance, there's an example here. Maybe someone's got an adult membership. They want to reserve a children's book. What should the outcome be? Should they be charged, or should they get it for nothing? So I'm going to pause just now for about 30 seconds to let you come up with 1 or 2 examples of your own, and please fire them into the Slack channel. Okay, great. I hope you came up with at least one on your own, and I hope you found that this format of context action to be quite simple. Now, I've run this simulation a number of times, and here's a sample example map that sometimes comes out of this. And as you can see, both the rules that we saw on the previous slide are represented by blue cards underneath the yellow story card. So adults pay a reservation charge of £1 per item. Children do not pay a reservation charge for their first 6 items. And then who we have, the one that I was talking about, it was in fact this one. Andrew is an adult member. Andrew reserves a children's book. The charge is £1 because adults pay a reservation charge of £1 per item. And this makes it really clear. It also makes it clear in this third example that as Andrew reserves more books, the charge goes up. It's £1 per item, not £1 per visit. Again, children do not pay a reservation charge for the first 6 books they reserve. There's a charge of 50p for other items. So Caroline reserves a children's book. There's no charge. Caroline reserves 6 children's books. There's no charge. Caroline reserves 7 children's books. The charge is 50p. Caroline reserves an adult book. The charge is 50p. So I'm sure you've thought of others, but you see that this is a really powerful way of illustrating rules that could otherwise have misunderstandings or misinterpretations. Over on the left, you see that there are a couple of question cards. What should we charge someone that reserves an item that is already in stock? Well, that's a great question. It won't be answered necessarily in this story, but the product owner can take it away and think about how the system should cover or cope with these sort of situations. And finally, what's the maximum number of items that a member can reserve? Maybe you shouldn't even be allowed to reserve more than 6 items. So again, it's down to the product owner to make decisions on those. Once we've got the concrete examples, now it's time to turn them into business readable language. So the business have had a huge, business with the BA or the product owner had a huge input when we were doing discovery with the example mapping. Now in formulation, we need to make sure that the wording that gets written up in the Gherkin format uses business terminology. So the translation is often quite simple. In the example card, we had a context of Andrew as an adult member. And in Gherkin, we could describe that or represent that as given that Andrew has adult membership. When he reserves 1 book, then he should be charged £1. This translation, this formulation is not always as straightforward as this, but frequently it is. This formulation doesn't get done necessarily or even advisedly by the product owner or the business analyst. As Matt described yesterday, we often want the people who have the most to learn about business terminology and most to learn about the problem domain. They should actually do the formulation, and it can then be reviewed by the product owner, the business analyst, and potentially the customers. When you are formulating your concrete examples into scenarios, we need to make sure that they remain useful within the context of enhancing readability, enhancing and dispelling ambiguity. So we came up with this acronym, BRIEF, to try and help us remember what makes a good scenario. So a scenario should be business readable with terminology drawn from the business domain. Wherever possible, it should use real data, like that concrete date that we saw in the first example of the 4th of May, 2020. Scenarios should be intention revealing. So they shouldn't describe the mechanics. So when we went to the library, we didn't talk about how we got there. We didn't talk about necessarily going up to the door. We talked about what we were expecting to happen, what the intent was. Like the library should be shut outside of business hours. Scenarios should only include essential information. You'll find when you work with any real system that there's vast amounts of detail that you could include in every scenario, but actually the point of a scenario is to illustrate a rule, and you should remove any details that are incidental to that illustration. Scenarios should be focused, so there'll be a number of acceptance criteria or rules for each story, but each example should only illustrate one of those rules. That way, if a rule changes or it gets deferred or changed, we don't have to muck around with other examples. It keeps things very focused, and it means that it's easy to understand and easy to maintain. And finally, the BRIEF acronym itself, BRIEF, it needs to be remembered, which is that scenarios should be short. And we typically recommend that scenarios should be less than 6 lines. There's a link to a blog post at the bottom of this slide, which gives more details. And this has been, we wrote about this in our book called Formulation, which I'll give you the details of at the end. So we've talked about discovery, where the product owner and the business are absolutely essential. Their involvement is necessary. We then briefly talked about formulation, which is the goal of which is to get those concrete examples found during discovery into a business readable format using correct business terminology. And the business are involved absolutely in reviewing those scenarios to ensure that they are correct and as expected. Automation is not an area that the business typically gets involved in. I just want to demonstrate why it's still of interest to the business. So here are a couple of scenarios that were formulated from that example map I showed you a few minutes ago. If you point Cucumber or SpecFlow or any of the tools that understand Gherkin at these scenarios, then it will read them and try and find automation code to execute. And when it does, it can color the scenario green for passing and red for failing. This is the definition of living documentation. So these scenarios document how the system should behave, And when you run Cucumber or another automation tool on these scenarios and it colors them green or red, it shows you which of these scenarios accurately describe the way the system is behaving at the moment and which of these scenarios are not. So, a quick thought experiment for you. Which would you prefer? Unreliable documentation or non-existent documentation? So, what would your preference be? Documentation that when you went to read it, you couldn't be sure if it was correct or not, or not having any documentation at all? Well, it's a kind of a trick question, but then think to yourself, which have you got? And almost undoubtedly, you've got unreliable documentation. Even though in reality, if you have the choice between no documentation and unreliable documentation, you'd probably be safer off with non-existent documentation. So one of the positive and massive benefits that adopting BDD can bring to your organization is a choice that isn't in this list. It's living documentation that validates itself against the system that you're building and is therefore reliable. It automatically tells you when the system diverges from the documentation. That doesn't necessarily mean that a defect's been introduced. So one of the things that happens is that as your product evolves, the documentation gets out of date. And you'll have seen this in normal documentation all the time. Oh yeah, that was right in version 2, but it's no longer correct in version 3. With living documentation, the documentation itself will tell you this before you ever release the software, the version 3 software. And the final cause of having a living documentation failing is that we've specified functionality that needs to be implemented, but it hasn't been implemented yet. So we've been through the discovery, formulation, and partial automation phase, but the implementation by the developers has not yet been completed. So I just want to do a quick case study of a company that we've been working with, well, we worked with for a number of years. And it's this information comes from a video, from a talk that a lady called Sheetal Patel gave at one of our conferences maybe 4 years ago, which is available at that YouTube URL. And they've been running a shift left initiative. And the reported results that that they identified and recorded is that they reduced the testing cycle. And that wasn't because BDD is about testing, because it's not. They reduced the testing cycle because there was less rework. They also reduced the defect count, and those two things obviously go hand in hand together. And this is all about learning early. Because they went through discovery, they had everybody with a shared understanding. The whole development process was a lot less troublesome, and therefore their time to market reduced. The team reported increased confidence and reduced levels of anxiety. And certainly in times like this, that's always something that you're looking for among your staff and your colleagues. And reduced manual testing costs. Now, let's be clear about this. BDD is not about testing. You will still want to do testing of many sorts if you follow a BDD process, and some manual and/or exploratory testing is absolutely essential to ensure quality. However, you will find that a lot of the checking that is often done by testers can be left for the Gherkin scripts, the living documentation, to perform on your behalf. And I'm just going to skip straight over this one. This also comes from Sheetal's talk, and talks about the 5 steps that they used to get towards the shifted left approach that they were looking for. So BDD consists of 3 core practices: discovery, where we create a shared understanding of the requirements through collaboration. We're using rules and examples. Formulation, where those examples are documented using business terminology. And automation, where that documentation is automated and that creates living documentation. And they should be covered in that order. So I know that a lot of people come to Cucumber for test automation. And if that's the way you want to use Cucumber, that's fine. However, if you want to adopt a BDD approach, you must start with collaborative discovery and move through to automation. As Liz Keogh, one of the creators of JBehave, said, get good at having conversations first. That's the discovery piece. Then get good at capturing the output of those conversations. That's formulation. And when you're good at both of the above, both discovery and formulation, now you can think about automation using tools such as Cucumber. Discovery should be business-led. So the business come to the discovery workshop with the story, with the initial acceptance criteria or rules. Formulation should be reviewed by business, and the automation gives business accessible feedback. So that living documentation that allows business at any time to look at the software system and go, yes, it's working. This is what's been implemented so far. So the takeaways that I would like to leave you with are that BDD is collaborative. Concrete examples are used to build a shared understanding. The documentation must be business readable, and automation is what creates living documentation out of that business readable documentation. And along with these green takeaways, I would like to leave you with the red or opposite takeaways to bear in mind. So BDD is not technical. Using Cucumber and writing code and doing automation may be technical, or rather not maybe, is technical, but that's not BDD. BDD, behavior-driven development, is about interactions between business and the technology team. Despite the fact that we've seen that discovery is, the first BDD practice, I often see it being seen as something that can be disposed with, and we can get straight onto doing automation using Cucumber. I can't say strongly enough, BDD is a collaborative activity. Discovery is not an optional extra. In fact, to some extent, discovery is foundational. The documentation must be business readable, but that doesn't mean it has to be written by the business. So it's not the business folk, the product owner and the BA that needs to do the formulation. They do need to review it as well as the rest of the team, but they don't necessarily need to write it. And finally, although automation creates living documentation, test automation is not the goal of BDD. If you approach BDD from that perspective, you are probably likely to feel some pain. So if you liked, if you were liked or interested in any of the things that I've been talking about, then Cucumber School at that URL has free courses, free online video courses in BDD. We also have remote training courses, which you can also access from the cucumber.io website. And there are a couple of books, the discovery and formulation books, which are available via the bddbooks.com website. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Slack channel, and I will now cease this share so that I can go across and have a look at my Slack to see whether there are any questions to answer. Okay, so at the present, no specific questions. However, we have some interesting, oh, sorry, there's now a question come through just so I was about to talk about the interesting examples that people had submitted. The question is, how would you recommend getting other stakeholders on board with BDD? So this is a question that I get a lot, so I'm able to answer it without having to think too much. The answer is you have to get people to experience the joy. We never try and encourage whole companies to adopt BDD all at once. It's not one of those massive big bang transformation efforts. What we do is we engage with 1 or 2 teams and run a proof of concept. And that's typically because the people who come to us looking for BDD are often testers or sometimes developers. It's very rare to have a CIO or a product owner comes saying we need BDD. And then when you can get a proof of concept running, that the benefit soon becomes evident. And if the organization is unable to accommodate the changes in working practices that regular discovery workshops with the product owner entail, then that soon becomes clear, and they can either take steps to modify their working practices, or they can realize that BDD is not going to fit with the way that their organization is at the moment. So basically, it's like so many other places. You start off by demonstrating it in a small, and then when you've got some advocates to support it within the organization, you enlarge it within areas and see the benefit throughout. So Kelly Hockendell came up with a question of what age is considered an adult. And that's a great question that needed answered. Possibly not for that story. The story there was about reservation charges, but we'd expect there also to be a story about who's eligible for child memberships and who's eligible for adult memberships. I have a question that says, what's your biggest challenge when writing scenarios? Well, the biggest challenge for writing scenarios from my perspective is not having been through a discovery process with people actively asking concrete questions using concrete examples. Once we get the concrete examples, converting them to scenarios is often quite easy. One of the pieces of advice that we give is, it's called write it upwards, which is when you've got your concrete example and you want to turn that or formulate that into a scenario, rather than starting with the context, the given, start with the outcome, the then. So you start off by saying, what is it that we should observe in this example to ensure that the system has behaved as we expected? And once you've captured that, then you can ask yourself, well, what action or event will cause this outcome to take place? So now you've got the when, and then finally you think about the given. And here, what the important thing about phrasing the given is to ensure that you remove any inessential details. So we want to make sure that we only have essential information. So we talked about, for instance, in the library example, we had so we were talking about Andrew having an adult membership. Well, there could have been lots of other incidental details there. So we could have said that Andrew was born on the 1st of January 1970. We could have said what his address was. We could have gone on to say that he already had a book out on loan. All of those things are inessential details if all this example is trying to do is illustrate the rule that if he reserves one book, he should be charged £1. Okay, and I've got another question, which is, who takes on what responsibilities in the Three Amigos meeting? And essentially, the product owner and or business analyst, the responsibility from them is to answer questions and approve or disapprove is the wrong word. Either say that an example is how the system to behave, or explain why it shouldn't behave in that way. And the job of everybody else there is to come up with concrete examples to challenge both their understanding and the product owner's understanding of what the scope of this story is. So everybody in the room should be coming up with concrete examples, except the product owner and or business analyst. And the product owner and business analyst should be answering questions that are posed to them by the concrete examples, or saying, no, that example is wrong, it shouldn't behave like that in that situation. And Who takes? Oh, we've got that one there as well. So I think that's me. I've answered the questions that have come up so far. If you have any further questions, please put them in the Slack and I will answer them offline. But thank you for coming along, and have a great rest of the day.